Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone into the afternoon, I think. And thank you to Emer for the introduction and to Sharon and Una for the invitation to speak here today. Boundaries in the form of town walls and defences were central to the lived experience of most urban dwellers in late medieval Ireland, so between about 1200 and 1500. Urban walls had a symbolic significance as emblems of urban identity, as well as a pragmatic defensive purpose. The circuit of walls provided definition for the town and protection for its citizens. The circuit was not continuous, of course. Most towns had at least 4 gateways, allowing in both wheeled vehicles and pedestrians. And additionally, there might also be small postern gates, allowing for pedestrians only. These gateways directed routes in, through, and out of the town and ensured that boundaries were also part of the lived experience of rural dwellers, particularly those who lived in the hinterlands of towns, but also those coming from further afield to trade, to visit religious houses, to attend court cases, parliaments, and so on. Depending on the size of the town, its hinterland or region could extend for anything from about 5 to 30 kilometres. My slide background is taken from the famous 14th century English manuscript, the Lutteral Psalter. This is supposed to be an image of Constantinople, but it depicts a somewhat idealized English walled town, most probably Norwich, given the Lutteral Psalter's creation in that East Anglian area. There is a central church, defensive walls, and a variety of building styles within the walls, including timber-framed and thatched houses, inns and alehouses, which are recognizable by the signs or symbols that hung outside them. At each end are a towered gateway and open portcullis. Out of one of the gateways comes a line of dancers being led by musicians while people look on from atop the walls. This is perhaps one of the least realistic elements of the image, suggesting as it does an openness and free-flowing movement through town walls. Walls and gateways are very often depicted on town seals, and we get a very different picture of their functions if we look at some examples of medieval seals for Irish towns. So here we see the seals for Dublin, Kilkenny Hightown, and Athenry. And what is emphasized here is the closed and defensive nature of the town. Martial imagery abounds. So while the gate may be open in the case of all of the examples, in Kilkenny and Dublin we see an armoured gatekeeper standing just inside the gate. We also have archers defending the town, horns being blown as a warning to the town dwellers, and in the case of Dublin and Athenry, the spiked heads of those who possibly tried to enter through the gates and were repulsed. Town seals from medieval England are more likely to feature religious imagery, such as the patron saint of the town inside a circuit of walls. However, Irish towns were much more liable to attack in the medieval period, so the protective features of the walls were more than just symbolic. Before we go any further, here are a few statistics about town walls in medieval Ireland, drawing on the work of Avril Thomas's very comprehensive 2-volume study, as well as the resources of the Irish Walled Towns Network. So Thomas lists in her work 56 proven walled towns. So these are towns that have visible, upstanding portions of walls or gates remaining, as well as documentary and sometimes cartographic evidence of those walls. She also lists 35 unproven walled towns. And these are places where there is some evidence of the existence of walls, perhaps even a charter granting finance for those walls, but no really definitive evidence that the walls were built. And there's a certain amount of movement in and out of these categories, but taken together they represent quite a significant number of towns. And looking at the map, again taken from Avril Thomas there, we can see that apart from the northwest part of the country, walled towns are to be found really across all of those areas, particularly the areas, of course, settled by the English in Ireland. The average dimensions of walls in height, they could be anything from 5 to 7 meters high, in width between 1.2 and 1.5 meters. The area they enclosed was very variable. Maximum size enclosed being 45 hectares, minimum being 4 hectares. The mode, or the point at which most examples fall, is between 10 and 15 hectares. And there isn't really a correlation between the size of the walled circuit and the importance or the population of the settlement. So some of the biggest towns, in fact, had relatively small walled areas. In the region of 38 towns have some visible above ground remains of town walls and or gates. These vary from substantial, in the case in feathered, to more fragmentary survivals of portions. And for Sharon, I put in Castle Dermot there as the example. In terms of gateways, less than 30 gates survive, which when you think that most of these, certainly the 56 examples, would have had, at least 3 to 4 gates, that is a pretty poor survival rate for the gateways. And the surviving evidence show that there's quite a range in terms of the structures of those gates, from quite simple gates to much more complex gates. St. Nicholas's Gate in the south wall of Dublin was 3 stories high and had 2 round towers outside the walls and 2 square ones within, with a portcullis for the gate. Newgate on the west wall of Dublin also had several towers with a gate and portcullis in between, and cellars. The gatekeeper might have living apartment in the gate, but gates and gate towers were also rented out as living quarters to individuals and families. In the 13th century, Robert Ashburn, who was mayor of Dublin, on a few occasions, rented the towers of the Newgate for 40 shillings a year, a substantial rent. For this, he also had use of the cellars and the city wall, and use of the grass in the city ditch. Urban gateways were crucial portals linking what lay inside the walls with what lay outside. In my opening, I spoke about urban dwellers and rural dwellers as if they were 2 very distinct and different groups, and of course they were not. And indeed, there were a lot of functions that linked those groups together, resulting in a very high level of interdependence between town and countryside. If we leave aside luxury and imported goods, most people in most towns relied on their town's hinterland to fulfill requirements for food, fuel, and raw materials. Provisioning was perhaps the most important aspect of the relationship between town and country, and one that can be seen as having benefits for both town and country. Towns needed rural surpluses to feed their inhabitants, fuel for domestic hearths and kilns, raw materials for industry, and timber and stone for building. Rural producers needed markets for their goods and also required items manufactured in the towns, such as shoes, knives, pots, and cauldrons, as well as imported necessities like salt and iron, and for the wealthy, luxuries such as wine, spices, silks, and fine metalwork. The symbiotic nature of the relationship can be illustrated by the rather humdrum example of the carts which came into Dublin loaded with hay and straw for the city's stables and departed with manure and night soil to be spread on the rural fields. I will briefly return to the topic of disposal of urban waste before the end of the paper, in the context of negative impacts that towns could have on their surrounding areas. If we look at the foodstuffs required in medieval towns, cereals for baking and brewing come top of the list. Bakers and brewers usually top the occupations found in medieval towns. There may have been as many as 200 brewers in the town of Kilkenny in the early 14th century. Peas and beans provided cheap sources of protein. Meat, fish, and dairy were also important, along with fruit and vegetables. Some of these items could be produced in the burgesses' gardens, but most of them were sourced in the hinterland. Urban industries also required a constant supply of raw materials. Tanning was also a significant urban occupation. Hides were brought into towns in great numbers, along with skins of a variety of smaller animals, including lambs, goats, foxes, rabbits, cats, squirrels, and badgers. No dogs, I'm pleased to say. It has been estimated therefore, that in terms of the cereal requirements of a medieval town of the size of Dublin, if we give a fairly conservative estimate of the population of Dublin as around 10,000 in the year 1300, that would have required the grain output of 60,000 acres of arable land. The flow of grain through the gates leading into medieval Dublin then must have been fairly constant. An inquiry in London circa 1300 found that between 200 and 240 carts carrying corn passed through Newgate daily. Dublin was much smaller than London, of course, but Newgate was just one of the gates into London, which also received a large proportion of its grain by water. Baking, brewing, and most methods of food preparation required considerable fuel inputs. When we add in the requirements of industries like pottery making and ironsmithing, along with fires for domestic heating during the colder months, we can see that urban needs for fuel could place considerable demands on hinterlands. One source that can provide comprehensive evidence of the products that were coming into the walled town for sale is the collection of 60-plus Murage charters which survive for the medieval period. Murage was a toll or a local tax which was raised on goods coming into the town, with the proceeds being specifically used for the building or repair of town walls. It was usually collected at the town gate by a gatekeeper or a specially appointed individual. Over time, many towns developed a practice of farming out the right to collect murage. So rather than paying people to collect these tax, somebody paid for the privilege of collecting the tax, a set fee, maybe 100 marks, and then it was up to them to recoup what they had paid by enforcing the tax. Goods that were commonly taxed included grain, of course, animals, fuel, wool, hides, skins, butter, and cheese. Most goods were taxed by the single load, but some products, particularly firewood, were charged per week. And we see this in the Murage grant for Dublin in 1295. In the section dealing with fuel, the tax on each cartload of firewood by the week is a halfpenny. Each horseload of firewood by the week is a farthing, which were simply a half or a quarter of the pennies. The Murage Charter for Castledermot, also dated 1295, uses that same wording in reference to fuel, but no other goods. So this really implies that fuel dealers and carriers were expected to be the most regular of visitors into the town market. Continental and English evidence suggests that around 2 cartloads of firewood were needed per person per year. So even a small town of 1,000 people or less might have required the equivalent of 40 cartloads per week. One of 5,000 people could have needed 200 cartloads per week. Wood is bulky and expensive to transport, particularly over land. So where possible, water transport was used, but this was not always possible. Therefore, it was important for towns to have access to areas of managed woodland close by. There is some documentary evidence that this was the case, and also some visual evidence. This is the depiction of Waterford, a very rare and unique depiction of an Irish medieval town, taken from the Waterford Charter Roll. And it shows a very rural area in the town's hinterland across the River Suir into South Kilkenny. There are trees depicted there, if you can make that out, and also rabbit warrens. This theme is picked up in Uto Hoggarzal's reconstruction of medieval New Ross, where we can see quite a wooded hinterland surrounding the town. And a much later example here relating to Kilkenny, Francis Place. Place's probably idealised depiction of the area around Kilkenny at the end of the 17th century depicts ordered stands of trees outside the walls. I want to look in a little more detail at those areas immediately outside the town walls. In smaller towns, particularly those with a very generous walled circuit, land might be farmed right up to the walls, and indeed the townspeople themselves often had rights to cultivate this land and to graze animals on it. In the larger towns, particularly those whose populations expanded and was constrained by the walls, distinct suburbs grew up. Howard Clarke identified 4 suburbs around the medieval town of Dublin, to the north, south, east, and west. In Kilkenny, the suburb of St. John was populous enough to have its own walls, and a smaller suburb grew up outside St. James's Gate in that town, as shown in Philip Armstrong's reconstruction. Suburbs were interesting, eclectic, and probably quite smelly. Towns generally relegated dirty or dangerous industrial processes to suburban areas. cloth fulling, tanning, lime burning, and pottery making frequently happened in the suburbs. Towns also regularly forced certain categories of people out from their walled areas. This was particularly the case in times of political upheaval, famine, and disease, when we really see urban dwellers closing in, really using the sort of protective and constraining features of their walls. Criminals and prostitutes were judged to have forfeited their rights to live in the town by their activities. Others were more innocent victims. Towns banished lepers, beggars, vagrants, and the undeserving poor of various kinds. Dublin frequently passed legislation calling for the removal of such people. There was nothing unique about this. In 1458, the municipal authorities of Dublin ordained that Irishmen and those who had beards above the mouth, which I take it to mean moustaches, should not be allowed to stay within the walls, and they, their horses, and their horseboys were to be removed. The ejection of humans from towns had impacts on settlement and the environment of surrounding areas, particularly suburban areas. Hospitals, notably leper hospitals, were found in suburban areas. Along with people deemed to be noxious by townspeople, there were substances considered equally noxious, and these too were ejected as far as possible. Chief among these substances were animal and human waste. It has been estimated that an urban centre of 5,000 had annually to get rid of some 250 tonnes of solids and 2,500 tonnes of liquid human wastes or sewage. Dublin in the early 14th century would have produced considerably more than that. Medieval towns were also full of horses belonging to residents and visitors. Cart horses, riding horses, horses that operated horse mills, horses associated with castle garrisons. Mary Beard reckoned that the horses in Pompeii produced up to 10 kilos of dung per day, each, I'm assuming. Less spectacular outputs came from dogs, cats, and pigs which roamed the streets. This clearly presented a problem. As far as possible, direct aquatic disposal was seen as the best method of getting rid of human effluent. There appears little concern about what effect this effluent had on watercourses or on those travelling, fishing, or working on rivers. Not surprisingly, a common medieval adage was that bridges were made for wise men to go over and fools to go under. Over time, most towns passed legislation requiring town dwellers to arrange for their rubbish to be brought outside of town walls for dumping. People found dumping rubbish inside the walls were fined. Authorities soon realised, however, that legislating for people to dump their rubbish outside the walls resulted in a very literal interpretation of outside the walls. So people literally would dump right outside the walls or even go up onto the walls and dump over it. This resulted in mounds of rubbish starting to build up right at the gateways. In 1400, the mounds of waste lying just outside the gates of the city of Paris were so high that they restricted passage and also posed a security threat as attackers could climb the mounds and hop over the walls. In the 15th century, Dublin authorities designated 3 large holes or pits where citizens could bring their dung. These were, not surprisingly, located in the suburbs. On a more salubrious note, suburbs were often areas where entertainment activities were located. Howard Clark designated Dublin's eastern suburb, which is pretty much where we are today, the recreational suburb. Here there were archery butts set up for practice, theatrical performances took place, and public executions were carried out, which were considered to be entertainment events in this period. Fairs also generally took place in suburban areas beyond the walls. There is much more that we need to learn about the areas outside town walls, especially when it comes to the smaller walled towns, places with populations of 1,000 or less. Here, archaeology comes to the fore, and I want to end up by briefly mentioning two very recent excavations on areas that lay just outside town walls. The first was in Carlow. So Carlow was a small medieval town, perhaps 800 to 1,000 people. The town grew up behind the Marshall Castle overlooking the River Barrow. The town was walled in the late 14th century at a cost of £500. These walls were described as being in a bad state of preservation in 1577, and there are no visible remains today. We do have property deed references to the gates, which apparently survived into the 18th century, and the former walled area can be conjectured, as you can see on the slide here, which is taken from a paper by Arnold Horner. In 2024, Geophysical Survey, funded through the Community Monuments Fund in the grounds of Carlow College, identified a series of anomalies that potentially corresponded to the line of Carlow's medieval town wall. So we're talking about this area here, which we felt probably lay outside the walls, but these linear features looked very interesting. So in August of this year, a targeted investigation of one of these anomalies took place. This was directed by Barry Lacey and funded by Carlow County Council. The excavation uncovered several archaeological features, some of which corresponded with the targeted geophysical anomalies. The primary feature uncovered and shown on the slide here was a wide ditch with a potential defensive function. Additionally, an earlier post hole was uncovered. This is being tentatively proposed as a mid-17th century defensive ditch with probable wooden palisade at the exterior. This suggests that the walled defences of the town were indeed in a poor state and requiring further enhancement by the 17th century. It is hoped that further targeted excavation will take place next year. The second place I want to mention is the urban settlement at Ardee, County Louth. It was probably of a similar size to Carlow, and it was also walled in the 14th century. Some fragments of the walls survive, and its circuit can be reconstructed with the help of later maps, particularly this very attractive map by Robert Richardson in the late 17th century. Two excavations took place here in 2024 in locations outside the medieval walls and produced significant agricultural and environmental data from a cereal drying kiln and waste pits. The material dated to the late 13th, early 14th century, when Ardee was a thriving market town. Roisin O'Droma has recently published the results of her archaeobotanical analysis in the County Louth Archaeological and Historical Society journal. This has shed light on both the crops that were grown and processed close to the town and the wider landscape management practices, including tree species found in the immediate hinterland. To conclude then, town walls were common in late medieval Ireland. Their functions varied from place to place and over time. Those constructed in the 13th century displayed the optimism of their Anglo-Norman town founders, while walling in the 14th and 15th century became crucial to survival for some of the smaller towns located in increasingly volatile areas. Walls were expensive to maintain, and in the Murage tax we have a perfect example of a functional tax aligning the collecting method with the purpose. The practice has also left us a rich collection of documentary evidence for town-country trade. Town walls and the way they were used by urban authorities had a significant impact on the environment of suburban areas, and this is the topic that will benefit from more archaeological and documentary research. Medieval townspeople were proud of their walls, even if they sometimes let them fall into decay. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medieval walls and gateways were seen as obstacles to progress, and needing to be removed to facilitate development and transport. Now, happily, people are rediscovering their town walls and rediscovering pride in those town walls, and that is very much due to the work of the Walls Towns Network and the National Monument Service. Thank you.